Iran had already planted its version of the story in public view. The Strait would stay closed. The Gulf was its hunting ground. That message was meant to do more than scare captains and shake markets. It was meant to tell everyone watching that Tehran, not Washington, had become the author of what Hormuz meant. Then USS Bruins caught MV Tauska in the North Arabian Sea, warned it for 6 hours, ordered the crew out of the engine room, and fired 5-inch Mk-45 rounds into the ship's propulsion space while it was still headed for Bandar Abbas. That single burst wrecked more than a machine. It wrecked the clean picture Iran had been selling, because once an Iranian-flagged vessel is dead in the water under U.S. fire, fear is no longer enough to keep your version of events in charge. The next image finished the job. Marines came down ropes from helicopters onto the deck, and from that point on, the crisis had a memory attached to it that no speech could wash away. Tehran could still denounce, threaten, and posture after that, but it could not erase the fact that the world had now seen who imposed the scene and who absorbed it. If you want the part nobody says cleanly, stay here, subscribe, and tell me below one thing. When a country can still create danger but cannot control the image that defines the danger, is it still in command of the moment? The wider fray made the humiliation worse. In that shot, the Iranian-flagged cargo ship is the object. The American destroyer is the force, shaping the moment around it. That matters because wars at choke points are fought with images almost as much as with weapons. And this image did not say Tehran owned the lane. It said Tehran's own ship had just become the example. This was the first interception since the blockade began, and Iran answered by calling it piracy and a ceasefire violation. Of course it did. Once the ship was hit and boarded, Tehran had to move the argument away from failed control and toward illegitimate force, because the alternative was worse, admitting that its claim of mastery over Hormuz had just been punctured in public. You can replace a vessel, you can argue over the law, you can threaten revenge. What you cannot do easily is rewind a moment once it is settled in everyone's head the same way, because Tehran's version of control was never just about shutting a lane and daring the world to react. The traffic system itself was being bent toward the Iranian side, near Larak, where ships would stop and face inspection by Revolutionary Guards forces before moving on. That turns passage into a test of obedience. It makes the waterway feel less like an international route and more like a corridor run through one armed checkpoint after another. And once a state starts adding tolls, fees, or selective conditions to a strategic strait, the message changes again. It stops being about emergency control and starts looking like ownership theater backed by coercion. That is a dangerous line to cross in a place like Hormuz, because a route the world depends on cannot function like a private gate where access changes with mood, leverage, or cash. That is the legal nerve sitting under the whole fight. Transit passage through a strait like this is not supposed to disappear just because one coastal power thinks the moment favors pressure. There is no similar route of equal convenience waiting nearby to absorb the same traffic, the same cargo, and the same economic shock. Once that reality is ignored, every tanker and cargo vessel starts sailing inside somebody else's political experiment. Put it more bluntly, states sitting on major waterways are not supposed to block them off for everyone else's commerce and call that normal. That is why Tehran's system was always unstable, even when it looked intimidating. It could create fear. It could force hesitation, but it could not turn fear into universally accepted authority. And Tuska exposed that weakness at the worst possible moment. By now, the issue was bigger than the ship itself. The real fight was over proof. Iran had already shown it could make passage feel dangerous. Washington now needed to show it could make defiance feel expensive. That is how supporters of the blockade see the seizure, not as random spectacle, not as one dramatic courting dropped into a news cycle. They see blockade as a pressure tool meant to force choices, squeeze room for maneuver, and make an opponent adjust long before a final settlement exists. From that angle, Tauska was not a side note. It was the first public demonstration that the pressure now had teeth. Before this, commercial vessels had already been turned around under the blockade, but being told to turn back is one kind of pressure. Seeing an Iranian-linked ship fired on and seized is another. Once that happened, the blockade stopped being something captains and governments could still test at the margins. It became a rule with a penalty everyone could picture. And the force behind that rule was not symbolic. More than 10,000 troops and 16 warships were tied to the blockade, including 11 destroyers, an aircraft carrier, a littoral combat ship, and 3 amphibious assault ships. A posture that large says something simple. Washington was prepared to spend real naval weight to keep this from looking like an empty bluff. The geometry favored Washington too. U.S. forces did not need to sit inside the Gulf, boxed in and waiting to eat mines, drones, missiles, or swarms at close range. They could watch from outside, reach in from distance, and still stop the ship that tested the line. So even the map itself started working against Tehran's story. Iranian proximity was no longer enough to guarantee Iranian command. That is the part people miss when they reduce this to one boarding. The seizure mattered because it converted theory into memory. After that, every captain, broker, and negotiator had the same ugly thought in mind. The next warning might not end with a turnaround. The fear was already in the water. Several ships had turned around as Iran tightened the Strait again, which means hesitation had reached the traffic before Tosca ever lost power. The U.S. did not invent that fear. It hijacked it. It took a climate Iran had created and stamped it with an American proof of it that widened the blast radius fast. Tosca was the first non-military Iranian ship the U.S. is known to have hit during the war. And that pulls the crisis out of the familiar military lane. Once a commercial vessel becomes the example, the conflict stops talking only to generals and planners. It starts talking to ship owners, traders, insurers, port operators, and every outside government that buys energy, food, or time through this corridor. The vessel also came with a traceable identity Iranian flag, named owner, named operator. That matters because the market digests risk differently when risk has paperwork, corporate links, and a route history attached to it. An anonymous wartime image fades. A documented commercial seizure does not. It lingers in contracts, insurance calls, port decisions, and quiet conversations nobody puts on television. At that point, Tehran had a real problem. It could still terrify the route. It could still promise retaliation, but it could not stop the center of gravity from shifting away from its slogans and toward the one scene everyone had now watched unfold. Iran did not need to win the optics of the boarding to keep fighting back in the information war. The harder counterargument was already available. Blockade itself is an act of war, and using it inside a fragile truce threatens to blow the truce apart. That frame helps Tehran because it drags attention away from the failed image of control and onto the legality and recklessness of Washington's pressure campaign. That is what made the timing so brutal. Diplomacy was not imaginary. Islamabad was already part of the visible architecture of de-escalation, and senior U.S. figures had already been placed in that frame. So when Tosca was seized, the message that landed across the region was not just military, it was political. The next phase might be negotiated in public, but leverage was still being written at sea. Now the title's harder meaning comes into view. Iran did not lose its ability to threaten Hormuz. It lost the cleaner claim that threat automatically equals command. That sounds abstract until you remember how power works. In a choke point, the side that supplies the image everyone else must think through usually takes the first advantage into the next round. And under all of this, blockade arguments, ceasefire language, state pride, naval muscle, more than 20,000 seafarers were still in the region, including crews stranded on vessels, unable to exit the Strait. That is the human residue of every grand claim made about control. People who never voted for the war, never shaped the policy, and never chose the timing, still end up trapped inside the pressure system it creates. The men on Tosca's deck were not arguing over doctrine when the helicopters came in. Other crews waiting nearby are not measuring prestige when fuel, food, and time start running thin. That is why this story lands harder than a normal naval incident. Once commercial crews become part of the proof, the crisis stops feeling distant. It gets personal. So no, Tehran did not lose the Strait. That is the lazy version. It did not lose the capacity to scare shipping, to spike costs, to keep this corridor tense, or to make everyone factor Iran into every next move. None of that disappeared with one boarding. What disappeared was something more useful in the short term, the simpler claim that Tehran alone was dictating the emotional weather of Hormuz. After Tulska, every mediator, every insurer, every ship owner, every crew, and every government now has another image lodged in the mind alongside Iran's threats. A U.S. destroyer fires. An engine room dies. Marines drop in. The ship is taken. That sequence is the damage, not because it ends the struggle, but because it rearranges the conversation that comes after it. From here on, when Iran says it controls the Strait, the world will measure that claim against Tuska. When Washington says pressure is working, it will point to Tuska. When talks wobble, when shipping stalls, when somebody blinks at the last minute, Tuska will still be sitting in the background like a fingerprint nobody can wipe. Off the glass. And that is where this story ends. Not at a podium, not in a legal memo, not in a slogan hanging over a Tehran street. It ends with the next bridge crew coming up on the Strait of Hormuz and knowing exactly which image will be in their head. Before the radio crackles,